The spring of 1975 saw one of the most concentrated humanitarian efforts in military history, as the Vietnam War reached its final chaotic days. While the fall of Saigon is often remembered through the grainy footage of helicopters on embassy rooftops, a massive, less documented logistics chain was moving tens of thousands of people across the Pacific toward a tiny island that would become their first taste of safety, Guam. A territory of roughly 100,000 residents at the time, suddenly found itself playing host to a population nearly equal to its own in just a few weeks. This was Operation New Life, a mission that tested the limits of the Navy's capabilities and the resilience of the Guamanian people. But as we explore today, the island's trials didn't end with the refugees' departure. Just a year later, nature would bring a second catastrophe in the form of Super Typhoon Pamela.
It's a staggering scale when you look at the numbers. Operation New Life officially began on April 23, 1975. And by the time it concluded on November 1st of that same year, over 111,000 Vietnamese refugees had passed through Guam. The Navy was essentially the backbone of this entire operation. While the Air Force was handling the massive lift of people into Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Air Station Nagana, the Navy, under Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison, was tasked with the actual care, housing, and processing. It wasn't just about transport, it was about building a city from scratch. Admiral Morrison was ordered to accept, shelter, process, and care for every person coming off those ships and planes. And he didn't have much time to prepare. The first group of nearly 100 refugees arrived just 2 days after the order was given.
That's an incredible burden to place on a local command. How do you physically house 111,000 people on an island that already has its own infrastructure to maintain? The Navy must have had to scramble to find space that wasn't just barracks or existing housing.
Scramble is the right word. They established 3 main mega camps and about a dozen smaller sites across the island. The most famous was Tent City at Arote Point. This was an abandoned World War II airstrip that the Navy Seabees, specifically from Naval Mobile Construction Battalions, literally carved out of the jungle. They bulldozed 1,200 acres of thick brush to make room for thousands of tents. At its peak, Arote Point alone held nearly 40,000 people. Then you had Tin City at Andersen Air Force Base, which used corrugated metal dorms built for B-52 maintenance crews during the war. The third major site was Camp Asan, located on the beach at a former hospital annex. Smaller camps popped up everywhere. The Naval Communications Station in Bargata, the Naval Station Gym, and even at the CB Mazdelco Sports Arena. They were using every square inch of available military and sometimes private property to keep people sheltered.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare, especially considering the conditions. You're talking about thousands of people packed into tents on an old runway in the tropical heat of Guam. There must have been significant health and safety risks, not to mention the basic challenge of feeding everyone.
The conditions were definitely primitive. According to reports from the Army Nurse Corps Association, one of the biggest issues was simply the heat and the waiting. People were packed 30 to 40 to a tent. Sanitation was a constant struggle. The Seabees built outdoor toilets, but they often became clogged because the infrastructure just wasn't designed for that kind of density. Medical teams from the 1st Medical Group out of Fort Sam Houston dealt with massive outbreaks of conjunctivitis and dehydration. But the Navy's role wasn't just on land. They had dozens of ships in the Pacific Fleet, 43 vessels at one point, supporting the evacuation. Some refugees arrived on these massive Navy ships, others on commercial vessels, and even on South Vietnamese naval ships that had fled the country. When those ships arrived, the conditions on board were often squalid. People had been standing for days. The Navy had to manage the disembarkation, the initial medical screenings, and then the transport to the camps using local school buses.
It's interesting that you mentioned the South Vietnamese naval ships. I recall there was a specific incident involving a ship called the Thuong Tin that complicated the end of the operation. It wasn't just a one-way street of people wanting to reach the U.S.
That's an important nuance. Not everyone wanted to stay. There was a group of about 1,600 people, many of them former South Vietnamese military, who demanded to return home because their families had been left behind. This led to significant tension, including a riot at Camp Asan where barracks were burned. Eventually, the Navy renovated a merchant ship, the Thuong Tin Ai, so they could sail back. The ship left Guam in October 1975, right near the end of the operation. It's a tragic footnote because, according to accounts from the ship's captain, Tron Din Tro, many of those who returned were immediately sent to re-education camps for years. Operation New Life officially wrapped up on November 1st, having moved the vast majority of those 111,000 people to 4 main bases in the continental U.S., places like Camp Pendleton and Fort Chaffee for final resettlement.
So the island finally catches its breath after this massive human influx. But then, almost exactly 1 year later, in May 1976, Guam is hit by Super Typhoon Pamela. It feels like the island barely had time to recover before facing another total system shock.
Exactly. Pamela was a monster. It was a Category 4 equivalent super typhoon with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour and gusts even higher. What made it particularly devastating wasn't just the wind speed, but how slow it moved. It crawled across the island at about 7 miles per hour, which meant Guam was battered by typhoon-force winds for 18 hours straight. It also dumped over 33 inches of rain, making May 1976 the wettest month on record for the island. The result was near total destruction of the civilian and military infrastructure. 80% of the buildings on Guam were damaged, and about half of those were destroyed or beyond repair. All public utilities, power, water, phones were completely knocked out.
Given that the military had just spent months building up and then tearing down these massive refugee camps, how did they pivot to disaster relief? Was the Navy's role different this time?
The Navy and the Air Force were essentially the first responders. Because Guam is a major military hub, they had the equipment and personnel on hand, but they were also victims of the storm. The Navy sustained about $120 million in property damage. Ships in Apra Harbor, including civilian vessels like the Peace Ocean, broke their moorings and ran aground. But as soon as the eye of the storm passed, the Navy Seabees from Battalion 3 were out in the streets. They established 18-hour workdays to clear roads and restore essential services. The Navy hospital at Agana became a critical node for treating injuries. There were about 300 reported injuries, though remarkably only 1 or perhaps 3 deaths, depending on which report you look at. The low death toll is often attributed to the early warnings provided by the military's weather tracking.
It's a bizarre irony that the very Tin City barracks at Anderson and the tent pads at Arode Point that had just housed the Vietnamese refugees were probably some of the first things to be shredded by a storm like that. It highlights how vulnerable that temporary infrastructure was.
You're spot on. In fact, many of the corrugated metal roofs from those temporary structures became dangerous projectiles during Pamela. There's a vivid description in a report from the time about car hoods being curled up like potato chips and tin roofs being hurled 2 miles away. The Navy's role in the aftermath was a massive rebuilding effort. They didn't just fix the base, they helped the local community. President Ford declared Guam a major disaster area, and the Navy worked alongside the Red Cross to set up food stations and water trailers. Because the commercial radio stations were down, the military provided the only reliable communication for a while. It took months for the island to resemble anything like normal again.
When you look at these two events back to back, Operation New Life in '75 and Super Typhoon Pamela in '76, it seems like Guam was the stage for a total reimagining of what the U.S. military could do in the Pacific. It wasn't just about projection of force anymore. It was about massive-scale humanitarian logistics and then civil recovery.
That's the legacy of that era. Operation New Life proved that the military could move a population the size of a city across an ocean in weeks. It was one of the largest humanitarian evacuations in history, and Pamela forced the military to rethink its own infrastructure. After the storm, there was a massive shift toward concrete, typhoon-proof construction.
If you go to Guam today, you'll see a lot of concrete houses with flat roofs. That's a direct result of the lessons learned from Pamela. The Navy's experience in 1975 and 1976 essentially wrote the manual for how the U.S. responds to both refugee crises and natural disasters in the Pacific today. It turned Guam from just a fortress into a vital humanitarian hub, a role it continues to play.
It's a testament to the resilience of both the service members and the people of Guam who navigated those 2 historic years. From the arrival of the first C-130s and Navy ships from Vietnam to the long months of clearing debris after Pamela, it's a period that defined the island's modern identity. If this look into a pivotal moment in Pacific history sparked your curiosity, consider sharing this episode with someone who enjoys uncovering the hidden logistics behind major historical shifts.